Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Couto. I'm a senior solution architect at Rightpoint, which is a digital agency located here in the United States. I work with a few folks in Jaipur. We have an office in Jaipur. And so I was invited to do this talk this morning. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. So my talk this morning is on the topic of ORMs and the fact that you can do Sitecore development with great efficiency, even if you do not use an ORM. So that's where I came up with this little title called ORM Less. Less is enough. So let's get right into it. So what is an ORM? And actually, before I continue, I just wanted to say, if anybody has questions, please go ahead and type your question into the chat here in Teams, and I will look at your question and answer it towards the end of the presentation. I think that will be the most organized and efficient way for us to go through all of the questions. I think before we get into it, let's just define what an ORM is. I think everybody on the call is probably familiar with an ORM. An ORM is a programming technique for converting data between incompatible type systems using object-oriented programming languages. So a very common ORM in the world of Microsoft development is Entity Framework. So Entity Framework lets you develop in C#. You create your models in C#. You create your objects in C#, and Entity Framework handles mapping your queries and your link statements into SQL queries. So Entity Framework is probably the most popular ORM, at least in the Microsoft stack. When we talk about Sitecore, we have a few ORMs that have been developed by Sitecore developers and MVPs and have been contributed to the Sitecore development community. The most popular one, as far as I know, is GlassMapper. There are some other ORMs that I have heard of but have never used. Synthesis is one of them. Fortis is another. There's also something called constellation.foundation.model mapping, which I believe was developed by a Sitecore MVP by the name of Rick Cabral. I believe the whole constellation framework is something that he came up with. And then another tool that I've used in the past, it's not an ORM like the other ones, but I thought it was appropriate to list it here because it has served similar purposes before, and that's Custom Item Generator. So in case you're not familiar with that, Custom Item Generator was developed by developers at Valier, which is another Sitecore implementation partner here in the United States. And it basically wrapped a Sitecore item object and provided strongly typed C# properties for each of the fields. And that's really what all of these ORMs do, right? So GlassMapper is the most popular one. It was developed by Mike Edwards, who I believe is from London. And it's by far the most used. I'm sure there's plenty of people, or if not most people on this webinar right now, have used GlassMapper. Synthesis and Fortis, from what I've seen just by looking, at their documentation and looking at their code on GitHub, Synthesis and Fortis follow the GlassMapper pattern pretty closely. The main difference that I remember is Synthesis and Fortis do not allow you to create classes for your POCOs. You are only allowed to create interfaces, whereas Glass does allow for classes and interfaces. In the past, I've used Glass up until probably the end of last year. I would always use Glass on a brand new project that I was starting. Sometime between the end of last year and the beginning of this year, I have started to transition to this new approach of Sitecore development, which, to be completely honest, is not anything different than standard Sitecore development. So all I'll be proposing in this presentation is that you can do a full enterprise Sitecore implementation using the tools that come with Sitecore out of the box, which we'll look at in a little bit. So these are some of the ORMs that I'm familiar with, or at least have heard of in the world of Sitecore development. So before I talk about what I'm calling the ORM-less approach, I wanted to just highlight some of the pros and the cons of using an ORM. So some of the pros that I have experienced, an ORM provides an abstraction layer. So when you are developing with an ORM, you are not necessarily concerned about the Sitecore implementation of a given field, the Sitecore implementation of a given class. Instead, you're concerned about the abstraction that you've implemented or that the ORM provides, right? So you create a class that has that is called, let's call it homepage, and then it has a field called description, and you're not really worried about anything else. You just work with that class and you work with that field and you get access to your content. The ORM handles that mapping for you. Along those same lines as this example, an ORM gives you a strongly typed object, right? So when you're using an ORM, you would have models in C# that represent each of your types in Sitecore. That is a very common way of using GlassMapper. You would, for every data template, you would have a GlassMapper class. You would have a class that's based on GlassMapper, and it would have properties that are decorated with Sitecore field. The class would be decorated with Sitecore type, template ID, and so forth and so on. Another pro of, and so before I move on, the pro of that is that you have a very verbose code that you can look at and say, okay, there's no question this code is related to the homepage. The class is called homepage. These are the fields that come from the homepage. I know what this is. Another benefit is ORMs can abbreviate some of the code compared to, for example, using the Sitecore API. And I purposely picked the word abbreviate because it doesn't always reduce the amount of code you have to write. Sometimes it really just changes the amount of code that you're going to write or the type of code that you write. And in some cases, which I'll show, using an ORM actually requires that you write more code. So in some cases, it abbreviates the code, but it's not always going to reduce the amount of code that you're going to write. And up until a few versions of Sitecore, maybe I'd say probably up until version 8.2 of Sitecore, ORMs were very helpful if you wanted to do test-driven development. Because again, especially GlassMapper, at least in my experience, GlassMapper provided abstractions for a lot of the Sitecore classes that you cannot mock. For example, GlassMapper has a Sitecore service class. It has a Sitecore context class, and those are classes that you can mock because they have interfaces. And so you can develop, for example, controller renderings against those classes and be able to write unit tests against your controllers without actually ever having to call the Sitecore API or actually retrieve data from Sitecore. You don't have to use fake DB. You don't have to use any of that. You can do all of your unit testing with just C# objects when you're using an ORM such as GlassMapper. I think I haven't had to do unit testing in projects recently, so I'm not 100% sure about this, but I've heard from other developers in the community that with Sitecore 9 and 9.1, Sitecore continues to provide overrides or mark classes as abstract so that you can override classes if you need to and implement your own version of a class, which is very helpful in allowing you to do unit testing against some of the lower level functionality of Sitecore. I do know for a fact that Sitecore supports dependency injection out of the box now. Even in many of its pipelines, it now supports dependency injection. So that also helps you be able to do unit testing. So these are some of the pros that I have experienced working with ORMs, specifically GlassMapper. So now I want to talk about some of the cons that I've experienced. So first off, like I said, in many cases, if not most of the time, you're going to write more code when you're using an ORM. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you're not writing an enormous amount of extra code, and sometimes it's warranted. There's good reason to do that. But it is a fact, when you're working with an ORM, you're going to implement the ORM layer in your project, and that usually is an extra layer of code. Another con is ORMs require more configuration, right? So, for example, there are config files that come with GlassMapper, and those configs are typically installed by NuGet, and as long as you're not doing anything fancy, those configs will just work. But as soon as you need to customize something about Glass, you're going to have to deal with configuration files. And in some cases, those configuration files can affect your actual Sitecore installation. And then now you're having to deal with a third-party tool that you're using for development that's now affecting your actual hosted site, your actual site. Another issue that can happen with ORMs is you might run into performance issues, right? So an ORM is an extra layer of code that is running, both at compile time as well as at runtime. So you can run into issues. These are two blog posts that were published by Sitecore developers in the community, where they talked about the impact of using GlassMapper on their projects. And then the second link from camchar.net is a blog post where Cam talks about how he benchmarks synthesis and compares the benchmark results of synthesis with GlassMapper, and he shows that synthesis is much faster. Another con, ORMs introduce another dependency in your project, right? So it's another dependency that you need to be aware of when you're transitioning a project to another team. It's a dependency that you need to be aware of when you're going to upgrade Sitecore, right? So it's something that is always going to add effort to whatever task you're doing with your project, whether that's a knowledge transfer or a upgrade or you're troubleshooting a bug. Learning curve. So there's ORMs are tools, additional tools beyond the actual Sitecore platform. So it's something additional that you need to learn. It requires paid training now. So Fortis and Synthesis, I think, are still free. And I think all of the Constellation stuff is still free. But GlassMapper now requires paid training. So up until a few months ago, there were, I want to say, somewhere between 20 and 30 tutorials on the GlassMapper website showing you pretty much everything that there is in Glass and how you do everything. Everything from the simple mapping a field all the way to, using GlassMapper to do unit testing and using the Sitecore service to create items in Sitecore and update items. So those tutorials were extremely helpful, and they pretty much taught you everything you needed to know about GlassMapper. And as Mike Edwards was adding features to GlassMapper, he would either add a new tutorial for that feature or he would add a blog post. About, I would say, 6 to 12 months ago, probably closer to 12 months ago or more than that, he decided to take down those tutorials. I think the blog posts are still there, but the tutorials are gone. And now when you try to go to one of those tutorials, it redirects you to a sign-up page where you can sign up for paid training. Now, just to be clear, I am not criticizing him for doing that. He has every right to require payment for a piece of software that he's written, services that he is providing. I think he mentions this on the website, that it has become close to a full-time job for him to maintain Glass. And there is a large number of developers in the community that use Glass. And so if it is that helpful to people, and it is that much work to develop and maintain it, which I think both of those are true in many ways, then, by all means, he should go ahead and charge for it and be compensated for the investment that he's made for the community. So I am in no way criticizing him for doing that, but it is something that as a development company, as a team, you have to be aware of that. So when you hire a new developer, if they know Glass, that's great, but they're not going to learn the new features of Glass unless they get training, because the new features are they're going to be developed, they're going to be released, but they're not necessarily going to be published anywhere online. And then if you hire a developer that doesn't know Glass at all, you can try to teach him yourself, or you can pay to have him, go through GlassMapper training. So that was, I will be honest, that was probably the final drop in terms of me deciding that moving forward, I would look for a different approach to development that did not rely on a third-party ORM, because I don't want to have to be going back to training for something, that is really just not, it's really just a little bit helpful for development, in my opinion. So anyways, moving on. A third-party tool like an ORM is not officially supported by Sitecore, right? And I think everybody knows that, but there might be people that are not, that fact is not top of mind. But that is a fact. If you have an issue with your Sitecore project, with your Sitecore site, and it ends up being an issue with Glass, you're not going to get support from Sitecore because it's not a tool that Sitecore wrote. They don't support it. So you can create issues on GitHub, and Mike Edwards, will look at those issues and try to resolve them if he can. You might be able to resolve those issues on your own if you download the source code and fix the source code wherever the issue is, and compile it again for your own use. So it's something to keep in mind. And then this is also an interesting fact. Sitecore has published knowledge base articles on issues with using Glass on a Sitecore project. So, and it's kind of surprising to me that this hasn't caused more development teams to consider a different approach to development. I think, from what I've seen, most teams are still defaulting to GlassMapper as a foundational tool that they use in their development for Sitecore. But this has been acknowledged by Sitecore. There are performance issues when you use Glass, and they may not be very prevalent in your project, but they could become an issue in the future, depending on how much content, for example, your site ends up accumulating. I've also received emails from Sitecore architects and Sitecore sales engineers that were advising clients and prospect clients to avoid using GlassMapper because of the performance issues. The recommendation from Sitecore architects was to use the API and use the custom item class that comes with Sitecore if you need that, but they were very explicit in recommending against using GlassMapper. I've got just a few more cons here, and then I'll switch over to what I'm calling my ORM list approach. So another thing that I've noticed, and this is very specific to Glass now, there are multiple ways to do the same thing. So for example, if you wanted to render an image field using Glass, you could do that in two ways. You could use the editable helper method in your Razor files, or you could use render image in your Razor files. Both of those will accept a C# property of type glass.fields.image, excuse me, and we'll render those. We'll render that image field for you, but they render with differences. So I don't remember the exact differences, but I think editable supports inline editing of an image field, and render image does not by default. However, render image allows you to set an attribute called is-editable. And if you set that attribute to true, then you can now inline edit in Experience Editor. You can edit an image field that was rendered using render image. So it's two ways to do pretty much the same thing. And it leaves developers asking which one is the right way. So then you can have a discussion with your team, and you can say, we're only going to use editable, or whenever we have an image, we're always going to use render image. So, but it's to me, it's an unnecessary discussion and sort of process that you have to go through. And it's really just because the developer who wrote GlassMapper decided to provide these two methods. In a similar way, you can use editable, or you can use render link to render a general link field. And again, I think the main benefit is render link by default does not support Experience Editor inline editing. However, it allows you to set an attribute called is-editable, and when you do, it then supports inline editing in Experience Editor. And then another thing that I remember from when I used GlassMapper, there are two ways that you can essentially specify the model for your view. You can either explicitly specify the @model attribute of your view, of your Razor files, or you can set your Razor files to inherit a Glass view of type, right? So type homepage, generic card, whatever your type is, whatever your GlassMapper Poco is, you can set that type. So again, it's just not clear which one you use, and there isn't any IntelliSense documentation that you can look at and say, oh, okay, so there's a performance benefit to using this one, or this one is going to do something better or whatever. It's really just, there are two options. You figure out what you want to do. If you want to have your team follow, a standard, you can do that. If not, your team is going to use different approaches. So it was a bit of a problem for me when I was developing and using GlassMapper and having different team members use different helper methods to accomplish the same thing. So I thought that was a con. And then another thing that has made me think about this topic a little bit more as well is the fact that Helix has changed the way we develop for Sitecore. Before Helix, at least in my experience, I followed the domain-driven development pattern. So I had a project that held all of my models. I had a project that held all of my business logic. I had a project that held all of my presentation, a different project for data layer. And I had all of these different projects that were specific for their domain, their what they do. And then Helix comes along and says, that is not okay because it causes too much dependencies between projects, and it's harder to maintain a solution where there are a lot of interdependencies. So my understanding of Helix is that Helix focuses on maintainability. And so one of the easiest ways to maintain something is to decouple, right? To have things be isolated, because if things are isolated, if two things are isolated, then when you change the first thing, the likelihood of you affecting the second thing is very low. And so that's my understanding of Helix. What does that have to do with RMs? So when I was doing development prior to Helix and I was using GlassMapper, I would have a project that had all of my GlassMapper models. Now that I'm following Helix, I don't have one project in my solution that has all of my glass models. Instead, I have the specific models in the specific projects where they belong. So for example, if I have a global header feature in my site, I'm going to have a global header project, and all of my models, controllers, services, views are all going to be in that one project. And if I have a global footer project feature, I'm going to have a global footer project that has my global footer models and controllers and services and views. So I no longer need to have all of my models in one place. At any given point, I'm only worried about one model or two models or maybe three models, right? And when I say models, I'm thinking data templates. I'm only really worried about a handful of data templates, the ones that matter for this feature. So what that did, when I did use GlassMapper with Helix, it caused a lot of issues for me in terms of it added complexity. So I had to come up with clever ways of generating models across projects because I still wanted to use GlassMapper, but I wanted my glass models to be in each specific project. And it just added more work than it provided benefits. And then again, as I was saying, with Helix, you have limited scope and you have limited concern at any given point. When I'm in one project, I'm only worried about the things that are related to that project. So I don't need to have all of my models all together anymore. So what is the ORM less way? Really, like I said before, and I hope that I'm not going to disappoint anybody who got up on Saturday morning to listen to me talk, but the ORM less way is really just using the things that we learned at Sitecore training, the things that Sitecore supports, which is really the Sitecore API, primarily the kernel and the MVC DLLs, right? And then when you get into other areas of Sitecore Search and XDB, XConnect, there are specific DLLs for that, which ORMs have not replaced. So I'm not listing those here, but really the things that we typically use ORMs for are for what the kernel can do and what the MVC assemblies can do. So the Sitecore API, kernel MVC, they contain all of the classes and methods we need. Using the kernel and the MVC APIs, you're going to get the most optimal performance possible because it's been, optimized by Sitecore. It's been tested by Sitecore. You're not adding anything else to your solution. You're just using the DLLs that are always there, whether you're writing any code, right? Those DLLs are there. Like I said, you learn the Sitecore API and the MVC API through Sitecore certifications. So again, going back to that example of you're hiring developers, you send them off to Sitecore training, they learn the API, they learn the MVC API. They don't learn ORMs. They come back to your office, they can work on projects with you if you are using the kernel, the API, and the MVC API. If you've got other dependencies in your solution, those are things that your developers have to learn. The Sitecore API is 100% supported by Sitecore. So if you have an issue, if you have a performance issue, if you have a runtime issue, a compilation issue, those are things that you can go back to Sitecore and show them the code that you're writing and the code that you're trying to execute that's throwing an error, and they'll provide support for that, right? They'll even give you a Sitecore support DLL in case they find that there is actually a bug in one of their DLLs. And then the last point I made here is that it's proven to suffice through past experience as well as recent projects such as Habitat Home. So I'm making the point here that it's not just old projects and small projects that are okay to use the Sitecore API and the MVC API. There are teams that only develop with the Sitecore API, and they have been doing fine. And in fact, Sitecore themselves, with the Habitat Home example that they have published for us to show us one way of implementing Helix, they're not using any ORM. They're using just the API for their development. So it is doable. It is, enterprise ready. There's nothing wrong with just using the Sitecore API. So another point of mine with regards to what I'm calling this ORM-less way is the fact that I still recommend using automated code generation. So that's part of my process. So I'm suggesting here still use a tool like TDS that will generate constants for you. So the main difference here in my approach is I don't have TDS generating the entire interface for me or the entire class. I only have TDS generating the constants for me. Why is this a good thing? Because it saves developers time. It reduces or eliminates human error. It standardizes naming conventions, and it stores magic strings in a single place. So this, and I'll show you an example of how I've put this together. But this is a critical point here because a lot of times when we think about GlassMapper, we think about the fact that we can work with strongly typed properties and we're not writing magic strings anywhere. I'm recommending the same thing. I'm just saying that you don't need to actually create POCOs to represent your data templates. You can use the Sitecore API to render all of your content, but store your magic strings in a constants file. Okay, so let's look at some examples real quick. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't necessarily have all of these in working order on my local, but I'd like to just show you some variations in the amount of code that you would have to write. That's really the point of my examples here. So this first example is what I call a page-driven component. So this is a component that just there's a field on the page, and when you put this component on the page, it just renders the content from that field. Let me switch over to my desktop now so that I can share my other windows here. Okay, so let me go to my page title. Okay, so this is the code that you would need to write if you were using just the Sitecore API and the MVC API. This is very straightforward, right? So there are a few usings. I am defining my model to be the model that comes with Sitecore out of the box, which is sitecore.mvc.presentation.rendering model. And then I'm really just using the Sitecore helper, which is the field method, this method here, field, and I'm passing in the constant for the content title field. So this constant was generated by TDS for me. It's stored in my project. In my case, I don't actually have any content in here. But this is the idea. So TDS will generate the constants for you. So you can see in my example here, I don't have any magic strings anywhere. If I were to change this field name in Sitecore, or if I were to move this field to a different template, then I would not get a compilation error because by default Visual Studio does not compile views, but I would get a compilation error at runtime, or a just-in-time compilation error, which would tell me, hey, you know, this field doesn't exist, so go fix that. So this is all I would have to write to render a single field using the Sitecore API. Now let me switch over to some sample code that I have for GlassMapper. So what I'm showing here is, in addition to the constants that I am generating no matter what, that holds my field names and my data template IDs and things like that, I also have to generate an interface or a class to hold that field so that I can then render that field. So this is, you know, about an additional 6 lines of code that I have to write here. Now, you can have TDS generate this for you, and I would typically do that, but that's still additional code that's being written. It's just the generator is writing it for you. And then down here, I'm showing the amount of code that you'd have to write to render that field, which is not very different. In this case, it's pretty much the same. There is a single method in Glass called editable, and you pass it a field, and it will render that field. Okay. Let me go to my next example. So my next example is what I'm calling a generic card. So this is a component that takes a data source. So in my example here, my generic card, again, there is a constant that's being generated that has the fields for my generic card. So this is being generated by TDS for me. My generic card has a controller rendering, which really just takes the current rendering, the rendering context, and passes it on to a service. The service then does the work of getting the Sitecore item based on the data source or the context item. So those are layers of code that you'd have to write no matter what, if you're using Glass or not. And then here is what you would write on the front end if you were using just the Sitecore API. So in this example, I'm actually showing that I have rendering parameters. So background color is a rendering parameter that I'm able to pass through. So in this example too, I am purposely generating a model that will hold just the fields that I need. So in this case, my model holds a field for the background color, which is a rendering parameter. So I can't render that using the Sitecore API. I have to just get that value out of the rendering pipeline for this component and just render that on the page. But my actual item that has my fields is just a Sitecore item. Okay? And so I just rendered those items, those fields here. So again, I'm using the out-of-the-box Sitecore helper, the Sitecore MVC helper for rendering fields, and I'm specifying the field. And I'm showing here that I can do additional attributes. For example, I can set a CSS class on an image field if I wanted to. I can also set a CSS class on a link. So Glass has a similar helper for this, excuse me. This is when you need to wrap a field in a general link field. This is how you would do it using the Sitecore API. Again, fully supported. You can do it with the Sitecore API out of the box. If you were to do this with Glass, you would need the constants. Then you would need interfaces or classes that represent each of the data templates that are involved here. So in this example, I'm showing that you need a data template that holds a GUID property called ID. And then all of your other templates need to inherit that. All of your other interfaces need to inherit that. I'm not showing that in this example, but that's the point of this, is you would need all of these extra interfaces in order to be able to render those fields on the front end. And then when you actually get to rendering those fields, here's where I'm showing the various ways. You could do it this way, or you could do it this way, or you could do it this way. Those are all 3 different ways of doing the same thing, rendering an image field. And really the main difference is you are or are not providing support for is editable. And then the other fields are pretty much the same. And then my last example here is when you have business logic driven components. So for example, a component that has to go out and get content somewhere from the content tree. So an example would be the global header. So the global header has children items, and sometimes it might have to go somewhere else to get the logo. So again, I'm following the same pattern here. But in terms of my view, again, I can use the Sitecore helpers to render my fields. So for example, if I wanted to render my logo wrapped in an A tag, I have a begin field method that I can use. I have a field method and an end field method that I can use. Similar to the generic card example, for the global header, I've created a model that's specific for this scenario. So it's a model that has a property called navigation links, and it's of type IEnumerable. It's an IEnumerable of type item, right? So again, I'm still sticking with the out-of-the-box sitecore.data.items. And then in my view, I'm just looping over my links and I'm rendering all of my different links. If I were to do this with GlassMapper, I would need a property that has the GUID, a property that has children. So this is one way that I could do it. So GlassMapper has automatic detection for the Sitecore children attribute. So if you decorate a collection variable with Sitecore children, it will populate it with the children of the item. Infer type is something that sometimes works with Glass. In order for infer type to, what infer type does is it strongly types all of your children in this collection. But it only works if you have interfaces in your code that represent all of the inheritance stack for a given type. If you're missing one of the inheritance templates in the stack, infer type won't work. So I've had a lot of issues with infer type since switching over to the Helix pattern. And then all of the extra fields that you have to write. Here's an excuse me. Here's another example of how you can get a collection of items. So this is another way of getting children with GlassMapper. So you can do a query, right? So you could say, starting on the item that I'm on, get me all of the immediate children where the template equals this. Excuse me, and that will populate a property of items for you. Again, it's an alternative to doing the same thing. You can get children, or you could write a query to get children. So it leaves you again wondering what is the right way to do it. You know, which approach should I take? Should I have my team pick one approach and stick to it, or should I let my team choose the approach they want to use? And then when we get to the rendering code, it's pretty much the same. There isn't a lot of extra rendering code. Okay, so let me just bring this back up. That's pretty much it in terms of what I wanted to present. So let me see if we have any questions or any comments. Okay. I don't see any questions or comments right now. Does anyone have any questions or any comments?
So if anybody has any kind of question with this presentation, you can type in the chat window.
Please provide Git repo source code so that we can go through it. Sure. So for my sample project here, I believe that's what the.
Yep, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah,
yep.
yeah, I guess that is for your sample project.
Yep.
Without the ORM.
Yeah, absolutely. GitHub/Couto. Let me just grab that link right now, and I'll paste it in the chat here for everyone. Right.
Yep, I will also update this information to our team.
Great.
Sorry, that meetup.
Okay. All right. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Doug, I have question one. Like for the existing development, suppose I have got a solution where we have developed the glass mapper things, and suppose I am a new guys and work out on the existing solution. So what was the good approach? We will go with the existing which have already glass mapper things, and or should I will go with the ORM less? So this is my question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you'll have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. One may argue that it's better to continue using the glass mapper in that solution because it will maintain consistency in the solution.
Okay.
But to your point, if you're new to Sitecore and you're not familiar with glass mapper, it may be a bit challenging to use glass mapper. So the best you could do is you could maybe ask a colleague. You could look at the solution and look at different ways that the previous developers did things in the solution and try to borrow some ideas from there and basically try to learn from what's there. I would probably say in a solution that is using glass mapper, I would probably continue using glass mapper. But then if I continue working with that client in the long term, and for example, I reach a point where I'm going to do a Sitecore upgrade for them, and it's a significant project, and I can squeeze in some budget to maybe take glass mapper out and just use the Sitecore API, I may consider proposing that. And then, you have to explain the pros and the cons of doing that. But I think those are probably, it's really when you have a milestone in the project, I think is when you would be able to make a change like that.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody showing up. I appreciate the questions and your attendance.
Hello.
I hope. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question from the glass mapper.
Okay.
Does the glass mapper ORM provides early loading or eager loading or lazy loading concepts?
So that's a good question. I think in many cases it does try lazy loading. In some cases, I think it does eager loading, but I think it's not consistent. From what I remember, I'm not 100% sure, but from what I remember, in some cases it does have lazy loading, but it's not in every property.
So can it be handled by the developer as per requirement? Is there any idea?
In terms of sort of forcing lazy loading in Glass, you mean?
Yeah.
It might be possible through configuration updates, or there might be attributes that you can put. I know there is a isLazy attribute that you can add to properties. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the lazy loading functionality of Glass to really give you a definitive answer.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess we can add some attribute for the lazy loading, but the cross question for this question here is that is this lazy loading can be achieved without ORM?
Okay. Yeah. So can you achieve lazy loading without ORM? Okay. So probably not, because I don't think the Sitecore APIs implement lazy loading. I think when you construct a Sitecore item object in C#, it gets populated with all of its properties. Now, that in general, that should be okay, right? Because you have a limited amount of components on the page, and you have a limited amount of items being rendered. So the places where that could be a problem would be, for example, search results, right? So you got back 1,000 search results. You wouldn't want to turn all of those search results into Sitecore items. You would want to do pagination, right? And display 10 results. Those would be 10 Sitecore items. And then when the user clicks next, you get 10 more Sitecore items. So I think you would look to use sort of development best practices to avoid issues that lazy loading might kind of hide or delay for you. But I think those are issues that you would have with Glass no matter what. If you loaded 1,000 items of Glass in memory, and all of those items have a huge inheritance tree, you will have performance issues. In fact, that is one of the main ways that you get performance issues with Glass. And you get those issues with Glass more often than you would if you're not using Glass, if you're just using the API.
That's great, Sam.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
does anyone have any questions?
No.
All right, I think we are good now. So thank you, Doc, for staying late for us and giving this useful presentation. Just for the information that total of 25 people attend today's presentation. Great. So it's really good for us, and we are looking forward to be present in Sitecore user group in future.
Great, awesome. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.